Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, Francis Tapon. In this episode, I have a fantastic conversation with Traveling Mitch, a guy who has traveled all around the world by living all around the world. Yes, that's right. He actually settles down in a place and explores it. So we talk about places that he's lived in, like Istanbul. We even briefly talk about Nicaragua. He goes and lives in Scandinavia, like Oslo and Norway and South Korea. And I talk about all these different regions and the pros and cons of democracy, why he has tattoos, what are some of the Scandinavian stereotypes, will the two Koreas unite in the next 40 years, and how can you actually live abroad? What's his future plans? What about K-pop? Have you guys heard about that? And why is South Korea the way it is? We also talk about Ataturk, the modern founder of Turkey. And what's his traveling style? How does he pull it all off? And what about relationships while living abroad? You're the first guest I've ever interviewed who's actually lived in the center of the world.
Indeed, yeah.
Now, this is not New York City, contrary to popular belief.
Yeah. So,
where's the real center of the world, according to those who live there?
So, undoubtedly, Istanbul, Turkey. And
I thought you were going to say Nicaragua. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I spent some time there as well. Yeah, I mean, of course, I could spend an entire episode talking about Istanbul. But I mean, I absolutely loved living there, and I think part of the reason I loved living there is because you do have that incredible history there, and it is the center of the world in a lot of respects. It certainly, most respects I can think about. Whenever there's sort of any global turmoil going on, Turkey's in it one way or the other, or people are concerned about which way they're leaning, and I think that's fascinating. But I think it also, I mean, I'm not sure if you've been to Istanbul yourself, but it's one of those cities that it's got this illustrious history, and yet the people, at least I found, maintain a certain sense of humility. I didn't. I mean, not to call any cities out, but I have felt in cities, perhaps like Paris, you kind of felt like, or New York, for example, like you kind of feel like,
or Rome.
Yeah, sure, exactly. These are places where, there's a certain attitude there, like, yeah, welcome to the center of the world, and then you go to the actual center of the world, and the people there are kind of just like, welcome to Istanbul, I hope you like it.
Right, and I've often pointed out that people like in Athens or in Rome, these great centers of empires that fell, a lot of the people do have a bit of swagger. And I'm like, well, as Obama once said, you didn't build that. And I feel like telling that to them, but it's not. I mean, I remember that even Mark Twain, he said that the modern Greeks, after he went to Greece, and he was completely disappointed that people weren't walking around in togas and acting all regal. He said that they're like a libel to the ancient Greeks. In other words, they're kind of like they're an insult to the ancient Greek tradition. He was so disappointed. Mark Twain was just furious after having gone to Greece, expecting such high expectations. He's like, "This is it. This is what the people are. the descendants of these amazing tribe that just made this incredible civilization. This is it." Anyway, so yeah. So getting back to Turkey. So yeah, in many ways, it was where East and West met, right there at the Bosphorus River. That's kind of where Asia becomes Europe and vice versa. And yet, I think about 70% of Istanbul is on the European side. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, so it really just kind of depends on where you draw the borders, because Istanbul is one of those cities where, I mean, I would say for anybody listening from a tourist perspective, I think that's pretty fair to say. I mean, if you're going to be talking about the highlights of the city, Galata and Beyoğlu and Cihangir and all these modern areas on across from Sultanahmet, which is Sultanamet's the old town, and where you'll find the Blue Mosque and the Hagia Sophia and the Basilica Cistern and Topkapı Palace and all of those sorts of places. And all of that's on the European side. But you'll find that, people who have lived there for quite some time are probably seeking refuge in Kadıköy, probably the most famous area on the Asian side, which is known for being hyper liberal. And what I mean by hyper liberal is that, you know, when there's somebody in power who might be exercising that a little bit too much, I think a lot of people are taking their lead from the way Katakoi is reacting to that. And it's a really fascinating sort of neighborhood. But I think, yeah, generally speaking, you can say that certainly the more famous portions, at least at this point, are on the European side. But I certainly, like, it never got old to me to hop a ferry across to Asia, and be back for dinner time in Europe. So
right. What about in Kapakoi? Is that where they might have protests demanding for, let's say, gay rights and things like that? Would you find that there, or is it still too conservative in Turkey to even think about that?
Yes and no. I think most of the quote unquote formal protesting that happened would probably start around Taksim Square and go down Istiklal. And if you've been to Istanbul before, Istiklal Caddesi or Istanbul Street, Istiklal Caddesi or Istiklal Street is the kind of the main throughway that snakes from Taksim Square down to Shishane, which is where the Galata Tower is. And a lot of protests would literally start and go, from the top, from Taksim Square all the way down the street. And at its height, I think something like 2 or 3 million people were walking down that street per day. So it's a statement to sort of walk down that street in a group. When I arrived in Istanbul in 2014, I believe there was a relatively successful, you could say, LGBTQ walk that I think was reasonably supported. I think leadership became more conservative while I was there, and I think attitude shifted a little bit. And as a result, I think there was another parade of sorts in 2015 or 2016, but it was eventually, I think it was broken up with tear gas, and that's not to paint Istanbul. I think it's important to draw a distinction between. I think Istanbul was a pretty liberal and open-minded city, but the government while I was living there was not quite as open-minded, we'll say.
I see. And that has changed under the new regime that is kind of still in power in 2020?
That's correct. Yeah. So there's like the central tension of Istanbul or Turkey for me at least was the most revered figure there, Gandhi, if you will, is Mehmet Kemal Ataturk. And Ataturk is someone worth revering. I think in a lot of ways he secularized the nation. He brought science and culture to the forefront. I think. But
hold on. Now, with Ataturk, I thought that one of the things that might be interesting to find out, and I did go to Istanbul. I've been to 1 or 2 other places in Turkey, but I don't consider myself at all an expert. So I didn't have the chance to ask this question. Now I want to ask you is, if you were to survey the people, and maybe even read if such surveys exist, about people's opinion about Ataturk, who lived about 100 years ago, if I remember correctly, or was in power 100 years ago. What's the opinion nowadays? Because, like, as a side issue, we in the West kind of revere, if you will, or admire in many ways, Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, for he brought glasnost and perestroika, and he revolutionized and quote unquote modernized the Soviet Union. But if you ask Russians, only 1% approve of Gorbachev, which is totally different. So I'm just curious if we're doing the same thing with Ataturk.
Ataturk is still hugely revered in Turkey and Istanbul. It's an intense reverence, and like to the point where I was teaching there. Now I'm writing and doing a million different things full time. But at the time I was teaching in Istanbul, and like if you were going to have like a children's day, for example, you would not do that without probably songs, related to Ataturk and with large banners with Ataturk. Like you wouldn't, but that's changing. It's changing in the sense that the person who's in power now, Erdogan, is looking to, in my humble opinion, looking to become the new idol. And I think he's looking to shift eyes. But that's not necessarily going over well. That's the central tension in Turkey and Istanbul, is this love and reverence of Ataturk. And for people who don't know, Ataturk was basically responsible. He was in the Turkish army, I think infantry in World War One, I think, and I think when after World War One, when people were sort of coming in to take Turkey apart as spoils of war in some sense, he sort of led a resistance against that and kind of kept Turkey's independence. And then I think if I remember correctly, he governed from the mid or late 20s until the late 1950s, but radically changed the nation. So he is the sole reason. If people think about, like, if people are worried about going to the Middle East or whatever, but they're somehow comfortable about going to Istanbul, that's probably because of the measures that Ataturk put in place to secularize the nation. And so this is the tension, that this modern nation of Turkey is built on secular principles of Ataturk. Ataturk literally meaning the father of Turkey, and Erdogan, the current leader, is looking to go back to Islam, and that's causing some intense tension in the nation. And I think that the last time I was in Istanbul was in July. But I still have friends who live there now, and as far as I can understand, there's still that tension there. It's
a minor correction for those who are listening, Chris, is that I agree with everything you said about him. The only issue is that I'm 99% sure that he died before World War II broke out, and so
is it 38?
He didn't go into the 50s. Yeah, 38, not 58.
Okay, because I know there's...
You said in the 50s.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I'm still curious about is that why...
you're right. Sorry. Apologies. 1938. And the reason I remember, the 8 they usually put on its side for infinity. Sorry, apologies. 1938.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no worries. No, but everything else you said was accurate. But I'm still curious because I know that Turkey has, like any country, has a conservative population in certain parts. Maybe it's 1% of the population, maybe it's 20%, I don't know, but there's a certain segment of Turks who are conservative to the point of being angry, I imagine, that Ataturk took away the Arabic alphabet and converted it into a Latin-based, or whatever you want to call it, English-based alphabet, the same characters that we use in the Roman alphabet, and probably say, you took us away from Islam. You took us away from our quote unquote traditions that we inherited from the great Ottoman Empire and all these other things. And you took us, so I imagine some people must be poo-pooing that, no? Or was it like less than 1%?
No, that's exactly right. And I think it's not a dissimilar tension that you see in the US, where people are, not upset to have a leader, in power who is propping up religious values again, and all that, and potentially all that comes with that. And I think in Turkey it's more pronounced in the sense that I think Istanbul is quite liberal. You have some other cities like Izmir and things like that which are very liberal, but the further east you get from Istanbul, it's still very, very conservative. Gaziantep and Van and a few other spots are extremely conservative, and that's where he has a large base of support, because it really is, despite the fact that modern Turkey is based on secular values. Yeah, you have all these people who are trying to go back to, they're trying to go back to that Ottoman, that period, that amazing golden hue, that they believe existed back then. And I think that's a huge tension. And I think even in Istanbul, it's 99% of the people are practice Islam. But at the same time, there's a certain, like the bars, the meyhanes, and all those places are packed. So there's got to be something that gives there. But I think, it's certainly present. You're right on the money there. That's probably the central tension. Is there's still there's the thing about Turkey, I would say, is that the people there, and I have a lot of respect for it, have tremendous conviction in their beliefs. And I think you have two sides which are, it's not totally dissimilar to the U.S. You have some people who are hyper liberal and believe that there's a certain way to do things, and there's the opposite, which are conservative and religious and so forth, and that's a tension that we're seeing pop up across the world, obviously, right? But I think it's probably more pronounced, at least in my opinion, in Turkey.
One thing, Chris, while you were talking, I just went up on Wikipedia and just checked the date on his death. And I see where you got the 1957, maybe, because he died at the age of 57.
Gotcha.
So maybe that's when you probably thought of 57. That's my guess. But so he was relatively young, 57. He did a whole lot in a young term. I would disagree, by the way, when you said that. I think Donald Trump. I think you were alluding to Donald Trump when you were saying that he's bringing back religious stuff, because I don't think of Donald Trump as a religious leader, or maybe the vice president. He's much more religious than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is.
I guess what I mean is like sort of bringing back that, like hearkening back to a golden age, or propping up sort of conservatism in and of itself, sort of like in all that goes along with it. So when I think of potentially a conservative or Republicans, it's like we're bringing back hard-won industry, religion, so on and so forth. And sort of at the expense of, I guess I see where you're going, but
I just don't think that Donald Trump is a conservative. I mean, the guy was a Democrat for a long time. He's just, to me, not a bastion of conservative.
We're going off topic here, but pious.
He's a demagogue. He's a guy who wants to become like the center of attention, kind of like Erdogan was the center. In that sense, I agree. But I don't look at him as like a bastion of conservative. He's just a bastion of himself.
Fair enough.
Donald Trump.
Yeah, fair enough.
And whatever that may stand for, he'll switch issues.
He's malleable.
Not an ideologue.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's, as long as he's number one, then everything is great.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
If all of a sudden the whole nation, I don't know, wanted to be, on a certain issue, if he decides to go with that way, he'll go with that. He won't stick to his. But anyway, we're going off topic here. Let's get back on the main topic at hand, which is your travel style, which I find so interesting, because I guess I would look at people as three different categories as far as bloggers and travel bloggers and that kind of stuff. One is, I would say, maybe about 70% or 80%, the majority, are people who kind of more or less bop around somewhat randomly and chaotically all over the planet. One day they're in Istanbul, the next day they're in, I don't know, some other country, and they're just constantly moving, and that's fine. My style, I tend to pick a region, and then I just explore that region it's a pretty big region, usually a continent, and then I just go for that for a while, or a subcontinent, if you will. And then there's your style, which is, you pick a region to live there. You actually move your ass over there and you live there. And then you explore the nearby region around it. So tell us about the pros and cons. You probably put a lot of thought into this, about doing it your way. What do you think?
Yeah. So, as you said, I mean, there are a lot of pros and cons to all of those different approaches, and I think obviously with the quick approach, where you're tackling a bazillion countries in a short period of time, the benefit there obviously is that you're going to be seeing a lot. But you could put forth the argument that you also saw nothing if you're going at such a reckless pace that you can't really take anything in. I think the regional approach, I have done that as well, like you have. Although I mean I've checked out your content, and I even listened to your interview recently on the Zero to Travel podcast, and I know you're like, when you're talking about taking a region and doing it in depth, you really mean that. But for me, I mean, what always made sense to me was to try. What I like about going to a place and moving there and then traveling around there is that I don't just travel with the Canadian perspective. Being born from Toronto, I don't just travel with the travel writer's perspective. I don't just travel with. I'm also kind of carrying with me the perspective of the nation around me. So I kind of felt like when I was living and studying in Oslo, when I was going to Sweden, I had a better idea of not only Sweden itself, but how does Sweden relate to Norway. And then once I understood Norway and Sweden and how they related to each other, I could go to Denmark. And then once I understood Scandinavia, I kind of had a number of seats with which to disseminate the experiences. And I also feel like personally that there's value in trying to base yourself somewhere and try to understand, just gobble up all of the authors that you can, all of the books that you can, to try and understand the language. I have tattoos in multiple languages on me just because I've been impacted, I felt, by the places I've lived, and I try to carry those with me. And I think, if I'm talking about like the central reason why I wanted to base myself somewhere is because I think, at least for me, it's all of those reasons I talked about before, and also because I believe firmly that I like to go away, experience something fully, and then bring that back with me, bring those memories back with me, sort of in my preferred luggage, and take them apart back when I'm back in Oslo or back in Seoul or back in Istanbul, and then once I catch my breath, then I go back out again, and I think it allows me to get a certain depth to travel. And also, I think there's something fascinating. I mean, I'm sure you can resonate with this, but I think the concept, I don't think home is a location. I think it's a concept. And so I think you can create home anywhere. So, I felt just as at home in Seoul and Istanbul and Oslo and those places as I did back in Toronto. It's just that my home was relative.
Right. Now, what about your relationships that you have along the way? Because those who are kind of like the fly-by-night travelers, the guys who are just constantly moving, all they can really have is just flings, effectively, unless, of course, they're traveling with their travel partner, but they can just have flings. With you, you're kind of like at this kind of annoying situation, because you're kind of there. You're there in Nicaragua in a village. You're kind of there for whatever months or maybe a year or two, but you're not there permanently, or at least, and so does that make forming relationships? I'm not talking about just romantic relationships, although that's the main thrust, but also just general relationships, just because you kind of form this bond, and all of a sudden after 2 years of Oslo or 2 years of Korea, you all of a sudden say, gotta go.
I luckily met my partner, my now wife, back in 2010. So she hasn't been with me in all of the places I've been, but Bree wasn't with me in Nicaragua. She wasn't with me in Oslo, but Bree was living with me in Korea and in Istanbul. And so that wasn't so bad there. But as far as the broader question, and how do you create relationships and sustain those? I mean, I think it's difficult because it's one of those things where you're spending enough time in a place that you're going to be sad leave it. You're going to kind of have your goings, your comings in all directions are going to be imbued with sadness. You leave Istanbul to go back to Toronto, it's a strange mixed feeling. You're going to be sad to leave everyone in Istanbul, but you're going to be happy to see everyone in Toronto. And I think the only way that I've been able to sort of accept that is by understanding that I don't think my journey is really ever over. And, we go back to Istanbul with a certain sense of regularity. And it's amazing. It's before we know it, we're back at a table in an alley, in an alley off of a main street. We got food rolling and raka rolling, which is a anise flavored alcohol there. And I feel like I love that. I've had relationships that have had enough depth that I can go back to a place and kind of almost pick up where we left off. But it was harder in some places than others. When I was younger, for sure, when I was living in Oslo, I was living in the old Olympic villages there with 10,000 other international students. So I was 20 years old. And at that point, I mean, you can imagine I was going to every kitchen party there was in Oslo. The bars are so expensive there that there's a whole culture around kitchen parties or pre-partying and after partying. So you would go for you go to someone's place and have a vorspiel, which is drinking and having a good time before you go to the bar because you can't really afford that much at the bar. Go to the bar, and then you have a nachspiel, an after party. And at that point, I was pretty sad to be leaving Oslo because I felt like I had met so many people there. And at that point, I kind of thought my journey was coming to kind of thought to myself at that age that you do these fun things when you're young, and then you hang up your skates. You say goodbye to that, and you go and live a boring life because that's what you're supposed to do. So at that point, I was really sad because it wasn't just the people I was leaving behind, but I thought, when am I ever going to be able to do this again? And I think in Korea specifically, that was difficult because it was the first, even more so than Oslo. I'm not sure why. I just fell in love with that culture. I think probably because I was writing about it more fervently, and I was trying to go more in depth with it. So the long and the short of it is, it's with like all relationships, it's all kinds of complicated. But I think I'm now happy that there's a number of places on the globe that still feel like home. It's just a matter of acclimatizing to the hour change, and I'm off to the races.
Yeah, that's true. By the way, speaking about your time in Oslo, I just was curious because I had a little bit of sense, having spent several weeks in Finland, that Finland kind of feels like the young little kind of ostracized brother out there in the corner, kind of next to Russia, versus the Swedes, or like the big ass, badass guys who used to rule half the known world and still have a bit of swagger and cockiness to them. But I don't really have, and these are stereotypes, of course, but I don't really have one for Norway. Like, I know they have a lot of petroleum, but other than that, I just don't have this image of them. How do you guys, if you stack those countries next to each other, where does Norway fall in? And is my stereotype even fair, the ones that I talked about with Sweden and Finland? Maybe I'm completely off base.
No, I think you're actually pretty well right on the money. It's and I actually haven't had anybody ask me that before. This is something I thought about a lot because I traveled a lot in Scandinavia, and then as part of my requirements at the University of Oslo, I had to take a Norwegian language class and a Norwegian history class. So I was learning constantly. I was getting context left, right, and center in a formal way. It's fascinating. I think so for sure. Sweden and Stockholm. I think Stockholm's literal slogan is the capital of Scandinavia. So like they are not mincing words. They certainly have the historical empire to back that up. The Danes are probably second in the pecking order, I think, in that regard.
And by the way, one thing a Finn will constantly remind people is that they are not part of Scandinavia. They are part of Northern Europe, or the Nordic. They'll fall into that label, Nordic label, but not Scandinavia.
Yeah, and I think that's partially because they're not interested in being the fourth in line there, or fifth really if you count Iceland, but. Denmark, I think, is this basically, historically speaking, Norway was just sort of traded back and forth as a spoil of war between Denmark and Sweden for, I want to say from like anywhere from the 14th century to the 19th century. Like it was really just an additional, like, oh, you lost the war, we'll throw in Norway. And really Norway, it really doesn't come until its own. I don't even think they got independence until the early 20th century, and everything changes when they strike oil. And again, living in Oslo was really fascinating for me because you have a country that's now unimaginably wealthy, but they're a very reserved, and humility permeates everything about that nation and the people. So I think at this point, I'm not sure how much you know about it, but I think they have $1 trillion rainy day fund right now. Like literally, they have so much money that they can't put it back into the country because it would destroy the currency or screw up the whole global. Financial institutions or what have you, and so you have this contrast where Norway, I think they have a certain sense of pride in certainly they have they have good universities now, they have good schools, good public health care, and so on and so forth. But you have this nation that historically speaking has been the runt of the region, and then is unimaginably rich now. And I think they're currently trying to figure out what it looks like to spread their wings. From my experience there, I felt like Norway figured out that the best way they could sort of contribute on a global stage was to be, to house NATO there, to be the giver of the Nobel Prize and so on and so forth, and just sort of be this quiet intermediary. In a sense, but it's an interesting place. I mean, I'm not sure how much time you spend in Oslo or Norway, but it doesn't, it feels like a very strange mixture of a country that's had a not a straight line necessarily for their history, but is doing just fine now and is trying to figure out whether they should walk with a swagger or a limp or something in between.
In some ways, I really don't like democracy. I kind of agree that it's a terrible system, but compared to all the others, it's about as good as we're going to get in so many respects. So we kind of have to stick with it, because I always think that one of the big weaknesses of democracy is the fact that the future generations don't have a vote. You don't even get to vote until you're 18, but let alone talk about people who are going to be born in the 22nd century. Imagine if people born in the 23rd century could actually vote for policies and leaders of today. They would support certain policies that are radically different than we actually have, because the people who vote for today just vote for themselves, even though they say it's for the children. Bullshit. That nobody gives a fuck about their children or even their grandchildren. They just want to have a good life right now and fuck the world in the future. So my point is that Norway, out of all these places, actually has an incredible ability to look in the future. As you mentioned, they have the world's biggest, certainly on a per capita basis, slush fund, or whatever you want to call it, rainy day fund. I think it could be in the trillions. I don't know if it hit the trillion yet.
As far as I understand it, it is over $1 trillion now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So that's one piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is they have the global seed vault in Svalbard, which is their northern island there. I mean, think about that. Like, hey, we're going to put a seed vault, take all the plant seeds of the world and store them for future generations in case we decide to lose a bunch of plant species. We're going to have them here for the future. I mean, that's just another sign to have all this petroleum in their ground and off their coasts, and not to suck it up and use it, and to tax themselves. Their petrol prices are about twice. To fill up your tank with petroleum, with gasoline, is about twice the price as it is in the United States, even though they're swimming in the stuff. Yeah, and because they purposefully tax themselves to discourage the use of it, and to think about global warming, and to have a tax on carbon, it's incredible. To me, I really admire the Norwegians, but I know very little about their character, but they've demonstrated that of having incredible foresight, which we could all use.
It's very forward thinking. I really appreciated that. I think you're absolutely right when you talk about sort of this fabulous, I think the best way to describe it, they're just extraordinarily reasonable and logical about, I think we've built up a whole slew of politics around environmentalism and such, and I think it's relatively straightforward for them. And so, where else are we going to live? And I was sort of blown away by that simplicity, because everything, as you know, in North America in particular, but everything's a debate, and there was nobody seemed to be on the other side of that coin. I personally have a theory that it starts in kindergarten in Norway. As far as I understand it, at least if it's still taking place now, half the day in kindergarten, regardless of weather, had to take what took place outdoors. So I felt like everyone had a really deep connection with nature. And there's the old expression, which, as far as I'm told, hails from Norway, that there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. And I thought that was really poignant. I remember the first time I went hiking, I went with a few friends, and you can buy those plastic bottles of beer. And I was like, well, if you're bringing beer, how are you gonna get water when we're hiking? And they're kind of laughed, and we literally finished our beer walking to the hike. And then once you finish the beer, you wash it out in the running stream, and you fill it up with the running stream and drank water. You drank literally the water running out of the stream, and we're fine. And I just thought, well, this is incredible. And I'm not sure if that's still the case or if that's even something I should be publicly saying. But I do know that, I guess the biggest question is like, should we be so surprised? Like it's probably more appalling that I'm shocked that I can drink out of streams than the fact that I did,
Right.
But it was fascinating for me. I mean, and I guess, to draw sort of a full circle around that, when you talk to me about why do I go to a place and live there and then travel around from there, it's because I yearn for this sort of depth. I yearn to talk to not 5 people, but 500 people, and I want to be able to speak with some confidence about, what the general psyche is and how people are feeling. And I feel like ultimately I come from Toronto. Toronto, I think, is statistically the most multicultural city on the planet. So I already had this, what I felt was this like beautiful sort of fractured understanding of a whole bunch of different cultures and what that meant. And I, half the time I spent in my English literature degree, we talked about, we used Canadian literature to talk about what the heck is a Canadian anyways. And I think so. I'm always just like fascinated by sinking my teeth into really diving into another culture, especially cultures like, Korea and Turkey, for example, are like really strong, powerful cultures that seem to have a great sense of identity. And I come from a place that not only doesn't have identity, but our identity is our lack of identity. That's really, in a way, Toronto and Canada is, we literally, I know for a fact, we're looking around and saying, well, there's a melting pot and there's a melting pot, and we're happy being a cultural mosaic. And I think that's probably as close as you'll get to the Canadian ethos. And that's where I'm fascinated by. I want counterpoints to all the points that I grew up with and thought I understood. And I think probably to draw an even broader, sense of understanding there, like that's ultimately why we travel, isn't it? Right. To challenge whatever convictions we thought we had and let those be burst apart.
Either that or to go travel to kill people. Yeah! Right. We'll go to a far-off land to start a war.
Oh gosh, I didn't expect that. I love you for that. I went on this long diatribe, and then I was like, I just go and kill people. Oh, fantastic! I'm happy you went there.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I remember reading something about like join the army, where you can go to exotic places, see new languages, eat new food, and kill people. Something like
Hurrah.
that. Can't remember. Exactly. Hoorah. Speaking about faraway places and future-minded places like Norway, there's also another country that I admire greatly is, and you also lived there, was Seoul in South Korea. Not the country Seoul, but South Korea. Because here is, once again, there was 1955, they had the same GDP per capita as Ghana. And Ghanaians, where I spent some time, and they kind of remind me of this. They're like, we were at the same level in 1955, at the same GDP per capita as South Korea. Now look at them now, and look at us now. And I think they've grown, 19 times more than the other one. So my question is, did you get a sense were you living in the future by living in Seoul?
Yes, in a word. Yeah, I absolutely felt that way. I mean, I think both Bree and I arrived there in 2011 and were blown away. Seoul, for people who haven't been, when we arrived, there were 16 subway lines in the city of Seoul connected to 3 provinces, and Toronto has 2 absurdly measly subway lines that are laughable, when you get to a place like Seoul. I think you just look at, and also not to mention everybody at that time, we arrived and everyone were on their smartphones that were enormous. And they managed to somehow function in the deepest depths of the underground. So we arrived there and I felt like we just got a vision of the future from a technology and efficiency standpoint. Seoul works. It works well. And I can speak with some confidence about the fact that Seoul and Istanbul have a reasonably similar population, if you're including undocumented people for sure in Istanbul. And Istanbul works in a in a beautiful chaos sort of way, but Seoul works. Seoul works on time, and you can. I'm not sure if you've been. It sounds like you have been to Seoul, but
a couple times.
Yes, so you'll know that, like, how brilliant is it that you don't just meet at a subway station. You meet at a particular exit. You say, like, I'll meet you at I don't know, Gyeongbokgung exit 7. And it's like every single thing is meticulously thought of. So you're not just saying, like, I'll meet you at, like, in Toronto, I'm like, I'll meet you near the station, and then, like, they message me when we get above ground. But there, it's like, there's just not a lot of room for error, and they're just there's a cost to that efficiency too. I think there, when you're talking about that explosion of it was a 10-year period. I think it was an unprecedented 10-year period of growth, right? Historically, I don't think any country has grown as fast in 10 years. If I'm not.
Oh, yeah, I was talking more about 50. I was talking since 1950, and so I think they win the award for that for sure. Yeah. I don't know about the last 10 years.
No, not the last 10 years. The 10 years after the war, like when they industrialized when they modernized after the war. I think there was no 10-year period where a country grew faster. And
yeah, probably. Yeah, makes sense. Because, of course, part of it is that they're starting at the low base, but still, I mean, it's remarkable. They could have copied Ghana, but they didn't.
Right. You're right. And I think so for me, it's interesting. Again, I kind of always am trying to think about, well, how did that happen? Well, the resolve of the Korean people is incredible. The sheer force of will. I mean, the determination of the people there is remarkable. I mean, the Korean War was horrific. I mean, I think people would know it if they knew about the Korean War. I mean, the country was rubble, and to turn that around and build one of the most technologically advanced societies ever is nothing short of remarkable. However, it comes at a cost, right? I think nowadays, I think suicide rate is, if not the top, then the second highest in the planet is in Korea. And I think it's difficult because I think they're built on the back of sort of the idea of resilience and industry and as a result, I mean, there's people who are like desperate overwork, and there's a sort of a shame culture where and then I don't want to speak too generally about such a sensitive issue, but I think that one way or another, people are choosing suicide over the shame of not living up to a specific expectation. And I think I taught there I was teaching in a Hagwon at a private school for a period of time, and I had kids who had all sorts of abilities, just incredible artists, incredible everything. They all had, and when I was teaching in Korea more than any other place that I've spent significant time, I found most of the kids, regardless of their aptitude, were just said, I want to be a CEO. I want to be a businessman. I want to be, I rarely had a kid who said, I want to be an artist or whatever. I want to be anything but businessman or CEO. So, that's something to think about, but
well, somebody's got to say that they want to be an artist because South Korea has produced some of the biggest megastar pop stars ever.
Yeah. K-pop. I mean, even the K-pop thing is like, it's heavily regimented. Like, as far as I understand, these people are sort of groomed and then brought to K-pop camp, and then like they're molded into stars and then promoted as such. And it's intense because anyone will know who watches K-pop, like those videos and stuff, like the choreography, the everything. I mean, that's a full-time job being a K-pop star. But I think I don't know. I mean, yeah, I get that for sure. That's art, and there's also, I mean, if you go to Seoul too, there's incredible street art. There's an artistic vibe. But I guess the thing is, at least at the age that I was teaching, most of the younger kids. I mean, all I can say is that when if I taught a group of younger kids in Nicaragua and I asked, what do you want to be? There'd be such a wide variety of what people were interested in or were hoping to be, in Canada for that matter as well. But in Korea, it was a pretty standard answer. And I can't imagine that many 7-year-old kids are like, you know what? I can't wait to be a businessman. Right. But who knows? I mean, that's just my sort of conjecture on that. But I mean, whatever, like, it's and I should say just about, your initial question about the future, whether it's like I went to my first 4X or 4D movie in Korea in 2011, where like your seats are moving. I don't know if you've done this before. Your seats are moving. There's little things that come under your seat and hit your ankles during intense moments. Yeah.
And they spray water on
yes.
you and spray air on you. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So all that stuff was in place when I arrived there.
I get that feeling when I go through a car wash, but I leave my windows down.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, like one way or the other, I mean...
It's a lot cheaper, by the way.
Well, I'm just going to do that from now on. I'm going to put a movie on my smartphone and just put it up on the dashboard, and then we'll just roll through the...
And to go through the convertible, and you leave the convertible window down.
Beautiful. But I mean, you'll...
And do that in the winter in Canada. How about that?
I would not recommend that, of all the things. But anyways, I mean, Korea is an incredible place, though. I mean, I still have such a strong love for Korean food and Korean culture. I think it's.
But tell me about this. I mean, because Canada, I mean, Korea doesn't have, as far as I can tell, a great buddy friendship with Japan, and yet some of the things are so similar. They were both devastated by a war and rebuilt like crazy. Super diligent, organized, hardworking society. And they also have this death. In Japan, I know they have a term for being worked to death. In other words, suicide due to work. So again, that's another similar culture. And yet they don't like each other. And I can't help but think about Canada and the United States, where we also have very similar cultures. But as far as I can tell, I don't think the Canadians hate Americans. But I think that Koreans and Japanese have a far more deep rivalry than Canada has with the United States.
Yeah, I think that's for sure fair to say. I would say that Canadians and Americans we like to joke around and so on and so forth, but I can't say that I've ever been at a hostel and said, "Oh, there's an American over there." You know what I mean? I'd be more likely like, "Hey, you want to get a beer?" Right. I think
it also, by the way, I think another issue about it is like I was born and raised in San Francisco, and San Francisco always thinks it has this kind of big rivalry with Los Angeles. And when people go down and actually live in Los Angeles, they actually say, you know what? Actually, people in LA don't even think about San Francisco.
There you go.
So I think it's like that. Canada thinks there's a big rivalry maybe between Canada and the United States doesn't even think about, oh yeah, that neighbor up there. Yeah, they play good ice hockey. That's right.
I think it's the same thing with Aussies and Kiwis. But I think,
right, exactly.
But you know what I think?
Or Ukrainians and Russians.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think it's ultimately the old adage of the elephant and the mouse, right? I mean, the mouse spends a lot of time tracking in and out around the elephant and spending a lot of time in the shadow. But I think ultimately, probably in the case of Canada and New Zealand and some of those other nations which are beside behemoths, I think it's not that any person in Canada is aching to be American or wants to be American, but it's just hard to, how can you possibly not, you're on the American culture stream. It goes right past you. You know what I mean? You're going to intake all of that culture, and that can't help but have an effect in some way. So it's fascinating, but certainly, like when I think about the sort of the dichotomy or the relationship between Canada and America, it's jovial and playful in the sense that we fought on, whenever there have been major world wars, we fought on the same side. And I think that the central difference between Korea and Japan is that they have not historically, and in fact, Japan has, like whenever I'm not sure how much time you spend in Korea, but I used to go hiking a lot, and pretty much every temple, without exception, you'd go up to the top and it would say, this is a reconstruction of a temple that was originally built in the 13th century, which was burned down by the Japanese in the, whatever century, and then burned down again by the Japanese in the 18th century, and finally burned down for a third time in the 20th century. And I think, and that's a real reality, right? And so I think if I had to walk down the street and there was a plaque outside of a church that said originally burned down by the Americans, and you know what I mean? So
yeah, sure. It reminds me a little bit about the Hungarians. Hungarians have a lot of problems with many of their neighbors. They have, I think, about 8 neighbors in neighboring countries that touch on them, and at least half of them, if not 6 of them, they really don't like. And it makes me also wonder about the hierarchy of who's better. Do they like the Chinese more or the Japanese more, or who do they hate more?
It's a good question. I mean,
and of course, then you have the North Koreans, which is a third. But you're talking about living next to this big stream of culture, like the American culture when you're in Canada, and having this big stream. But they have these 2 massive streams. They have the Japanese one, they have the Chinese one, and then they have this kind of wacky little stream called North Korea. That's also kind of a thorn on their side. So I don't know how they kind of look at these 3 powerful countries, influential countries that are sitting right at their borders. Well, not, right next to them, let's just say, because obviously there's a sea that separates them. But what would you say as far as how they put the hierarchy? We've concluded that they're not huge fans of the Japanese, but what about the Chinese and the North Koreans?
Yeah, I mean, well, for one, I can speak to the North Korea issue. I mean, I've been to the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, and that's an intense place. But I don't get the sense that the average citizen has any sense of. I mean, I think for the most part, I mean, and I can only speak to. This could be unique to the people that I knew and was friends with in Seoul, but I felt like most people felt bad for the country was split in half, and there was a whole. There was half the nation was accelerated into the light faster than any country in the world, and the other country was, basically a canvas was put over, and they were kept in the dark. I think that it's tense because I think probably the North Korean regime is finding it harder and harder to keep everything quiet. But I'm not sure if you've been to the DMZ before, but it's an interesting spot because you've got these buildings that are supposed to show the progress of North Korea, and a lot of them you can see across the border. If it's nighttime, the light starts at the top and gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer and dimmer as it goes towards the bottom of the big building because there are no floors. So it's supposed to be a show of wealth that doesn't exist, and it's fascinating.
You're saying no populated floors.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like literally.
Otherwise, I was like, wow, there's no floors. Maybe it levitates.
Levitation. Yes,
they're truly advanced society.
Yes, very advanced. No, like literally, yeah, they're building
it's Cloud City.
Building what amounts to a shell, and there's a big light up at the top, and it goes down. I think now more than ever, Koreans are comfortable because they're culture machines now. My again, another theory of mine, but I think that the U.S. Part of the indelible mark they left on Korea was I think they worked with Korea to help them become a center of culture in the region because America understood better than anybody the power of culture and exporting your culture. And so I think literally the U.S. has groomed Korea to be the K-pop monster and the K-shows and all the Korean dramas and everything. Now it used to be that people were consuming content from Japan and China, and now Japan and China are consuming content from Korea, and that's a big shift. And I think that's. But I mean, as far as the relationship goes, I think most Koreans still feel more just really sad for their former compatriots. And the Chinese, I didn't really get to talk. I didn't really hear as much about the Chinese as I did the Japanese. And I think also you have to remember that the Japanese didn't just invade and sort of burn everything to the ground, but they were also it could not have been worse in the way that everything happened. I mean, I think they were besmirching major landmarks. They also probably one of the more horrific things that happened during the conflicts between those two nations is the Japanese had taken Korean women as what they were later known as comfort women. So they were taking women to bring along with the armed forces in war, Korean women. So that's something that I never could find a person who could stomach that very easily in Korea, and I think rightfully so. It's an awful thing to imagine, but as far as that's my general feeling about the nations. Most of the distaste was towards the Japanese, and there's still like some meaningless islands that they sort of battle over here and there. So I think the tension's still there, but I don't know. Like everything, I think probably the hatred and the intensity was more prevalent, around the times of the offenses. So, I mean, I get the sense now that Koreans are very, are focused on, forging their own destiny and their own identity and having everybody else in the region worry about them.
Now, when you look at your crystal ball, Chris, now tell me if you foresee war or union or something else. In other words, will the fate of the Korean Peninsula be Germany 2.0? In other words, East and West Germany joined and became one powerful country, and maybe the same thing will happen when the proverbial DMZ goes away, just like the Berlin Wall went down? Or do you imagine that it will decline into a war of some sort, the Second Korean War? Or something else, maybe a third option.
My personal feeling, and then this could, the problem with going on record and saying things is history can prove you to be wrong. But my personal feeling,
I just heard somebody say, whenever you make predictions, always do it at least 40 years ahead of time, because you'll probably be dead by then.
Yeah, so in 2050, I personally feel like I think reconciliation is going to be the step that happens. I think, but it's going to take a different leader at the helm in North Korea, and that's really my feeling. I think that.
The dude is really young. I mean, that guy is going to be around if he doesn't step down voluntarily or get pushed out. I mean, the guy's going to be there for another 40 years at least.
That's why I made the 40-year prediction. No, but I think I mean that, and that's a real thing. But I mean, if you know a fair bit about North Korea, you'll know that it's being propped up in a lot of ways by other countries who might benefit from having that country to stir things up in the region. And I think the real problem is that North Korea is built on the backs of misinformation, and misinformation on that scale is getting harder and harder to successfully. It's becoming harder and harder to successfully keep your people blind. And so I don't know whether that would ever result in an uprising of sorts, but I think eventually there's going to be an opportunity for reconciliation, and I think both sides are going to be happy to come to that table. Again, though, it's hard to say because it's a tense time in the world as well right now. So who knows? I guess I think at heart I'm an optimist, and I believe that there's. I believe that politics aside and governments aside and bravado aside, that probably people on both sides would rather be united. And I hope that really it's either Kim Jong-un, either he sort of comes to, I don't want to say comes to his senses, but I think he realizes that it's a charade you can only keep up for so long, or he doubles and triples down. Like we've seen other leaders do in the past. I mean, what's the old expression? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. So at the same time too, if I was why would the guy who runs this whole nation with an iron fist want to give up? I don't know.
Gorbachev did.
Fair enough. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. So let's hope that that's the route. But I would say that my feeling now is that before war would be reconciliation.
Right. No, I agree with you, and I'll go down for the record. So we'll go down together in a flaming ship if there's a big World War III that erupts from the Korean Peninsula. But I agree with you 100%. I think it's all this stuff is bravado, all this Donald Trump going against Kim Jong-un and the missiles and all that stuff. I just think it's a bunch of bullshit. It's just smoke and mirrors, and nothing's going to happen. In the end, nobody really wants to fight for anything. And so it's all just going to fade away. And eventually, like you say, the information gets out there, and the North Koreans will eventually revolt against their regime. I just been utterly flabbergasted and completely wrong when I thought back in the 1990s that Korea was going to be the last domino to fall that decade, because all the other communist countries fell, and I had to transform radically. Like Chinese officially still communist, but they had to transform so much that it's almost unrecognizable. But I just would have, and even Cuba has also had to transform pretty substantially. But North Korea, as far as I can tell, hasn't changed all that much since the 1950s. And so I don't know. I just don't see it.
Here's the thing that I've read a ton of books now, of people who have escaped from the regime and are writing about it, and they're talking about the fact that there is information getting into North Korea. So I don't know when it will fall.
2027, dude.
Okay, do you want to double down on that?
March 27th. There we go.
Okay, March 27, 2027.
There we go.
That's
it's going down, dude.
And if it happens, then
you owe me a pizza.
Yeah, well, or we'll go on Oprah together.
Okay, there you go.
but and obviously I hope that's the case. I think you're probably right. It seems to me at least that this is the last old-fashioned blindfold over your eyes dictatorship.
Yeah, it really is. It is.
Work and be quiet.
Even Bhutan. All sorts of countries have just kind of opened up in one way or another. It's just really, Albania opened up. God, it's like everybody has opened up. It's like these guys are like the last remaining bastion. It's kind of like the Wakanda of the world. It's hidden.
Yeah, on the wrong side of it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's also but it's fascinating because it's like people are enamored by North Korea because of that. It's hard to imagine a more bizarre, I don't know, just bizarre history or country or like I remember being in the DMZ. And the people in South Korea are like, don't make any sudden movements or whatever. Just be calm. And you look across the divide, and you look across on the other side, and there are North Korean guards who are looking at you with binoculars, and you're just thinking, how surreal is this? It's just it's just bizarre. At the same time, I would love to go to North Korea. I think we're probably aligned on this, that I think that people a lot of people just have been brainwashed, and I don't hold anything against the North Korean people. I just think the regime itself, we just hope it collapses, but ideally not in spectacular fashion. I mean, ideally in a way that, people aren't killed on mass scales, and obviously, I really, having a decent understanding of both nations, I would love to see what a Korea as one place would look like, how that would function. I think it'd be fascinating, and hopefully that will occur as we suggested on 2027, March 27th, 2027. Yeah. And if that goes down, you and I are writing a book, co-authoring it.
Exactly. Called "Eat This, Nostradamus." So there you go. Now tell us. Let's bring the listeners to a practical, useful tips now regarding how can they be more like travelingmitch.com.
Yeah. In what sense?
In the sense that somebody's listening to this and saying, you know what, I would love to do what you're doing, what Chris is doing, and actually going out there and living abroad for 6 months, 6 years, something. What would you advise them to do?
Yeah, so the first thing is trying to disseminate and trying to break apart what are your marketable skills, because it turns out that whether or not you're employed or not in your home nation, for example, if you're fluent in English, that's a tremendous advantage, one that you have to recognize. It's something you're I had plenty of people who I taught with in South Korea who were there for a year or two, and they had a bachelor's degree and they spoke fluent English, and that was enough to provide them with a career that they really loved. I think it's really easy if you stay put, and if you can be in Toronto and it's just not the right job market, and you think, well, I guess I'll just be unemployed for a while here. Or you can be creative and think about not only how can you use your skills elsewhere, but embolden your resume a little bit. So the first thing I would think about is what skills do you have to bring to the table that you could bring somewhere else? I think it's a different thing traveling in a place and working in a place and being a part of the rhythm. And I would consider studying at the University of Oslo to be also being part of the rhythm of a place. But I think when you get up with the people and you go to work with the people and you come home with the people, you learn, you feel like a part of something. Like I remember in Oslo when I would come home from classes in the afternoon, everybody on the subway would have their skis and they'd head out straight to cross-country skiing. And I just felt like a part of that, and before I knew it, I was cross-country skiing afterwards and I was a part of everything.
Hold on.
So I think,
hold on 1 second, because I realize I may be giving a wrong message to some of the listeners here, because a lot of people are hearing, you've been to Istanbul, you've been to Oslo, you've been to Seoul. All these are enormous cities. Well, Oslo is not that big, but anyway, they're big cities, capitals. And yet we haven't talked about a time when you did something completely different, which is your little village in Nicaragua. So tell us, as you're answering this question of like, how can we be more like you, Chris, then tell us a little bit more about your experience in Nicaragua. Yeah.
I mean, I think it still stems from the same idea, which is that you got to think about what you can offer and then ultimately where you can offer that best. And so that opportunity in Nicaragua actually came up to go and teach in a small village called Pearl Lagoon. Pearl Lagoon is had 4,000 people at the time, probably still does, and it was a Creole community in the autonomous region of Nicaragua. And
I didn't even know they have an autonomous region. What is that all about?
Yeah, they do have an autonomous region because it's
like from the Sandinistas or something.
I think it's a primarily Creole culture, and I think it was. I mean, it might be a drastic oversimplification, but as far as I understood, at least possibly theoretically during the slave trade in, quite some time ago, there were apparently there's a number of shipwrecks that happened there, and survivors might have come onto the shore to start a new community there. Whether or not that's true, I'm not totally sure, but I do know that there's an enormous portion of Nicaragua, the autonomous region, near where the Corn Islands are, which is primarily Creole and not Spanish speaking. So I didn't know any of that history, and so my lens there was not, sure, teaching English in Seoul was great, but I also in that situation was curious about impact. What sort of impact can I make? I think you want to feel like I can't possibly communicate to you what sort of joy I got. Everybody in the town called me Prof. I just walked around. Everyone said, "Hey, Prof, how's it going?" Actually, it was a whole, like, there was all kinds of awesome Creole slang that I picked up. So everyone would be like, "Hey, Prof," and they'd say, "How?" So like, "How are you doing?" And then the correct response was, "Right here." So I would walk around. Everyone would be like, "Prof, how?" And I'd be like, "Right here." And I loved that, and so I think, from a practical lens, when I'm talking about all the experiences, for me, it's a mixture of, okay, what places do I want to explore? What marketable skills do I have? And where can I make a legitimate impact? And I think those three things can guide you into new opportunities. And then the other thing, too, is just realizing that, we often think and overthink and, whatever, all these decisions, but ultimately you just got to go. And I know that sounds cliche, but I loved it because when I first moved to Oslo, I had a whole bunch of friends who were like, why are you going to Oslo? Like, why Oslo, Norway? I don't understand. And I'd be like, because you have to ask that question. That's why, because you have to ask that question and be stunned a little bit. And I think that's what it's all about, right? For a lot of journeys. And I also, I'm also a firm believer in the fact that, like, really there aren't any bad decisions. They're just decisions you can learn a little bit more from than others. And so I never really thought to myself, oh, well, what if I don't like Istanbul? I just figured I'd find my Istanbul that I did like. And I think that probably the best part about living abroad, at least for me, was that I felt like I was always furthering my mission there. I was always understanding more about a place, even if it was justifying going out at night and going to a live band and having some beer or whatever at that time on a school night. I think ultimately I kind of felt like I was taking notes and trying to learn more every single day. And that's part of the beauty of traveling is I think if done right, you come home with a tremendous vault of knowledge, but you didn't necessarily remember reading all the books,
Right. And by the way, for those listening, if they want to access your vault of knowledge, go to travelingmitch.com. And by the way, your last name is Mitchell. So why do people, your name is Chris or Christopher. Why do people, your friends call you Mitch?
Yeah, so at the time that I started the site back in 2011, I had basically the high school that I went to had, I think it had a lot of Chris's. And so it was just easier for everyone to call me Mitchell. And, you have good friends over the years. And eventually Mitchell became Mitch and Mitchie and all kinds of other stuff. And, one night I'd had a beverage or two in Oslo and Traveling Chris sounded a little too carnival-esque. Like a little like Traveling Chris. So Traveling Mitch it was. And I think, the other thing too is, and I'm not sure, I think there's a lot of people now who get into travel blogging with a real business mindset around it. Like for me, at that time when I started this website, I was just trying to make sure that I could just send all my family to one place. I didn't have to tell the same story and hop on 15 calls,
right.
Right. And it helped that I had a passion for writing and eventually it became this, but I never sat down and thought, what brand is going to be catchy? So here we are. I mean, it's kind of like one of those things where it works.
How long did you stay sorry, I'm still fascinated about your Nicaragua experience. How long did you stay there?
I guess in total it would have been a couple months.
Good. Okay.
So nothing too extreme, but I got pretty sick right when I got there. So it took me a little bit of time to get on my feet and get teaching.
They have a lot of mosquitoes down by that coast there.
Yeah. And also, I was staying with a family, this wonderful woman named Miss Ingrid, who was just great and welcomed me in like family. And I ended up drinking a little bit of the water. Just the same water they were drinking, but I kind of asked around and figured out what I could and should be doing. And it was this gray area that they had been filtering it, but I guess it just wasn't filtered enough for my weak immune system. And I ended up getting really sick for 3 or 4 days. So there was, it was pretty frightening at that point, because the nearest hospital was a 45-minute boat right away. But I was lucky that Miss Ingrid, she took me in like a son, and she would come in and pat my forehead with a paper towel, and she just nursed me back to health with coconut water. But it was brutal because it was really hot, and my room, it was a little room on a property that was kind of indoor outdoor-y. I remember there's this one moment where I'm just lying there like totally sick. I'm like, I really hope I get through this. And there's like a little gecko just staring back at me in the wall. And I'm like, if I wasn't so sick right now, this would be hilarious.
That's so funny.
But yeah, I mean,
what's next for you in this decade, 2020s?
It's a good question. I'm kind of happily based in Toronto right now, but based is sort of you'll know. I mean, I know just from following your stuff and the way you talk about travel, that it's sort of only a matter of time right before your next journey. You just can't stay put after a period of time. I really don't know. I was in New York last week. I'm traveling a lot around my own province right now and my own country and focusing on the Canadian stories. I just started another website called ultimateontario.com with another Ontario-based travel writer.
Can you repeat that, please?
Oh, sure. ultimateontario.com. Mm-hmm. And we're just focused on telling.
You're
some
focused
of the
on British Columbia?
Yeah, only BC for now. But I think the thing was that when I came back to Toronto and Ontario, I kind of had this like chip on my shoulder, like, well, it's not Istanbul, it's not like Antalya and Izmir and all these places. And then I realized that turns out probably the great equalizer is that everybody has their stories, and sometimes they're like, just ridiculously obscure, like the first bowling alley in Canada or whatever. And you're like, what? Or like, the only place that ever, harvested corn in winter. Like, and you're like, I don't even know what is going on, but like, let's go check it out. And actually something I'm planning on doing this summer with Bree, my wife, is there's a whole bunch of, of course, Canada was heavily immigrated, and so there's all these little towns like Paris and Berlin and all these places in Ontario. And so we're going to do a Euro trip. It's 5 hours, and I think you hit like 7 European capitals, but it's all in Ontario. It's like Paris, Ontario, Berlin, Ontario, London, Ontario. It's going to be fun, but I think, yeah. Anyways, the moral of that is I'm right now just kind of enjoying focusing on. I spent most of the last decade ignoring my homeland, and now I'm kind of refocused on it a little bit and seeing where that takes me. But at the same time, too, I'd be shocked if I wasn't. I'm going to be in Mexico in March and a few other spots. So we'll see. I'm excited about the next place I'm going, but I'm not as intense about making sure that I have 10 steps ahead, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, completely. And what is any final words of wisdom for people?
Well, I guess just the main thing for me is that something I talked a little bit before is just that when I was growing up and doing some of these earlier experiences, like living in Oslo, I just sort of had this feeling like, okay, so travel is something you do while you have a little bit of extra money, while you have a little bit of extra time, and then you give all that up and you live the rest of your boring life, and you just sort of you try to hold on to those memories that you had from the beginning to justify how boring things got and how tired you are and all this kind of stuff, and then slowly begin to realize that travel can be an enormous part of your life, and for me, I'm enormously blessed to be writing about travel, talking about travel, and a whole lot more now. And so I think the big thing for people to just think about is not necessarily to think about their life and then being on vacation, but understanding that there are a lot of brilliant ways that you can integrate and weave travel into your life in meaningful ways that I think at the end of the day you can figure out that you lived a much richer life because of that.
Well said, well said. Well, Chris, or Traveling Mitch, however you like to be called, thank you so much for taking the time to sharing with WanderLearn listeners about your stories and your adventures all over the world. And I hope you encourage people to travel profoundly, deeply, and spend as much time as they can to kind of really get to know a region and work there, integrate. And there's so many benefits that come from that. And it's a pity that we don't live thousands of years, but I'm glad you've been able to do this for several years. And that concludes this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we talked about, or if you'd like to comment on the show, or if you'd like to ask me a question, then go to WanderLearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is the username I use on all social media. You can also get to my website by going to ftapon.com. And here's one last reason to remember Tapon. If you like what I do and would like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. And now for 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it somewhere. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at WanderLearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.